bit of time talking about the planet Venus and its symbolism in astrology, and then extend from there into some other avenues of interest. Venus, in a very interesting book called The Rulership Book, which I highly recommend to any budding or professional astrologers. It gives long lists of things in the world that correspond to the planets, the houses, and the signs. Venus gives you one of the most wonderfully confusing long lists in the entire book. It includes everything from diplomats to musicians, from all sorts of sexual perversions up to mystical experience. It's a really confusing group of images. And I hope to clarify a little bit tonight why all those things are Venusian. Some of the definitions that have been offered for the Venusian energy are such things as the power to attract, which can get a little bit confusing with Jupiter, which being the power of expansion is also attracting things. Sometimes it's called the power of love in the world, but then we're told that Neptune is actually selfless love, and that Venus is a more physical form of love. It's been called the power of harmony in the world and all that. And I think that the greatest lesson we can learn from all the potential definitions of the planet Venus is that we're not really going to be able to get a simple few words of definition. Better that we just discuss it and then have a sense of what Venus is about in our own lives. Now, in the program, this lecture was described as having to do with the dynamic of changing self-indulgence into creativity. And that's sort of my stab at the definition of Venusian energy. Self-indulgence in the sense of doing what we want, when we want to, because it feels good to us. I'd say that was a good definition of Venusian energy working on the lower planes. It's a sense of things that really please us in a very comforting, almost childish way. It's the bad habits that we might have, whether they be drinking or whatever small vices we find especially relaxing, that give us a sense of euphoria. There's a key word about it, this euphoria that has to do with Venus. Now on the other side we have creativity, and I'd like to give a special definition to creativity. Creativity not in the sense of some specific art or skill, but creativity in the sense of an approach to life, a creative relationship with life. In other words, going out into the world to do things, and to do them in inventive ways, to be a master of variety, a master of forms, of skills, and to approach every aspect of our lives as if it were some form of creative work. Any event, any situation can be seen as an artistic work. And our lives, in a sense, are great artistic works. And many of the figures that we have in the tradition of Western esoterica, and certainly in the Eastern tradition, are individuals who did create of their lives a kind of living symbol. Maybe the most bold example of them was a Sufi saint who made the announcement after a very stellar career as a theologian, "I am God," and was promptly burned for it. But it just so happens that he knew exactly what he was doing, and the reason he did it was because if you then looked into his work, you would discover that he explained in his work what he meant by "I am God." That God was within him, within everything else in the world. And it was the God within him making that statement to the God within everything else. He was willing to die to symbolize that for generations that would come later. And of course we have the example of Jesus and of Buddha and many others whose lives took on so many shades of symbolism. In other words, lives that were so creative that we can no longer tell where the individual stopped and their allegory began. We don't know, for example, whether Jesus perfectly lived a life that was in accord with the sun moving through the seasons, or if there was a story to be told, and his own life was near enough to that that in the ensuing centuries we all became confused about which was which. But in event, In any case, what we're attempting to do is to live an artistic life. And the great obstacle to that is self-indulgence. Now, the thread that's common to creativity and self-indulgence is that euphoria, is pleasure. Artists, many of them, such as Rodin, highly committed artists, who worked enormous lengths of time on their creations, who were not the artists that had become popularized in our era, the kind of hard-drinking, hard-living type of artists, but artists who were almost like industrious businessmen in their approach to their work. Often said they did that because they were selfish. They got a sense of euphoria out of their creativity that nothing else they saw in life could possibly approach. And they just kept working on it because they felt that the more committed they were, the more euphoria, the better their art, the more sense of bringing something into the world, something bigger. So we have this spectrum of pleasures. And we can choose at what level we wish to experience them. I'd like to make a little aside here and talk to you for a moment about something called lucid dreaming. I'm going to use that as an allegory to explain the point about Venus. Lucid dreaming is a phenomenon that's been known for quite a long time, but is now becoming popular. There's a lot of psychologists studying it. And it's a phenomenon where we're having a dream, and we wake up in the dream. We realize we're dreaming. We say to ourselves, perhaps, this is a dream. I can do whatever I want. Sometimes we wake up at that point. Other times we begin to create the kind of dream we want to have. There have been individuals who have become masters of this form of dreaming experience. They, for example, might be nervous about taking an exam the next day, perhaps a driving test. And so they practice driving in their sleep. They're able to pretty much program themselves to do that. They've had a depressing day, so they go to sleep and they fly around all night because they especially enjoy doing that sort of thing. So it's a phenomenon that can be practiced, can be mastered. Now, if you consider the Eastern definition of this world, of our life here in our bodies, as being samsara, as being illusion, maya, or dream, then you have the idea that perhaps it's possible for us to wake up in this dream. In other words, to make this dream lucid. And in so doing, we become what is called an enlightened person. Now, to draw the parallel closer, when we have a lucid dream, we can do anything we want. We see that the other characters in the dream behave almost like automatons, like robots. And we also see that we can create tremendous things just by putting out the vitality, the force, the desire. The same thing happens when we wake up in a dream that is our daily life. We suddenly realize how many people around us are very much caught in habitual patterns of behavior. They're asleep. They're like robots. They do the same things every day. Same attitudes come to them every day. And we suddenly realize that if we put out tremendous amounts of energy, desire, we bring things to us. We recreate our lives. Now, if we've all gone to sleep somewhere in another realm to dream these lives, then we really can't judge each other's dreams. If we're down here to experience a very coarse kind of reality, a reality that has to do with a very profound and lengthy satisfaction of our physical desires, whatever they might be, then that's the dream that we have chosen. And if we're happy in that dream, then no one can judge whether we are right or wrong in so doing. So we don't address those individuals. Rather, we address people who went to sleep so as to dream much finer kinds of things. The kinds of ecstasies that have to do with selflessness, with love, with giving, with kindness, with creativity, those sorts of things. Now, our culture does not provide a tremendous amount of guidance to people who are interested in that sort of thing. And very often they think of themselves as being chronic malcontents or just plain cockeyed. Problem being that no one else they know seems to have these desires. Everybody else seems to be satisfied with either making money or going out and meeting persons of the opposite sex or collecting something or another. But somehow there's this stirring that just doesn't reach satisfaction with the things that satisfy others. And if we're lucky, we run into some form of a tradition, and that tradition says, oh yes, that's a spiritual craving that you have. In other words, what you're craving are the experiences of things like selflessness and sharing and what we call generally goodness. Now the beauty of all this is that nature is a master behaviorist. Nature knows that the surest way to get us to do anything is through pleasure and pain. Just that simple. When we're in pain, we look around for something to get us out of pain. When we're in pleasure, we want to have more of that pleasure. And a subtle thing happens. The self-indulgence that all of us, or at least most of us, go through at some time in our lives, provides us with these flashes of satisfaction and pleasure. But then they don't last very long, first of all. And many of them have these sorts of hangovers, whether it be alcohol or not. We go up and we go down. We have a sense that this isn't really getting us anywhere. Perhaps when we first approach this kind of behavior, we think to ourselves, well, perhaps I'm not doing it right. So we try 100 different ways of doing it over a period of years, only to discover that no, every time we do it, the pleasure always subsides in pain. And Buddha, of course, pointed that out to us, said that pain and pleasure went very much together in this world. But then there's a kind of pleasure that in Buddhism was called the no mind, at least in Zen. A kind of clarity and openness, a kind of ecstasy really, called that in Christian mysticism, that does last longer, it's more profound, the pleasure goes far deeper. It's the sort of thing that grips one down to the very bones. And that particular kind of pleasure is, you might say, nature's carrot on the stick for each of us. And that's what we're seeking. Some of us seek it through drugs. Some of us seek it through sexuality. We seek it in all these different places. But in the end, we're all seeking this sense of unity, of acceptance, of mingling, of openness, all those sorts of things, a sense of creative communion. And the place where we find it most profoundly is in mystical experience. We begin to feel as though we're going home. And then, of course, that experience begins to spread to all the others. And even our old bad habits, in their ways, become transformed and become positive things in our lives. At the very worst, if they were supremely bad habits, they become things that we can discuss with other people who are presently suffering what we once did. And we can have a sense of joy out of that sharing, out of that helping, that we wouldn't otherwise be able to have. So what we're talking about then is the self-indulgent kind of delusional energy. In other words, when we approach life with the idea of doing what we want to do because it feels good. And the realization that it does, but that it tends to fall away from us. That it doesn't feel good for as long or as consistently as we want it to. And then, of course, nature being, as was said, a master behaviorist, puts a great big dark shadow on all the rest of it. So even if we are having a grand old time, age and death sit in the distance, and they cast their shadow on our pleasures. And perhaps we're fortunate enough to be young for a while and not be aware of those feelings. Many of us are, even in our youth. But then slowly they begin to show their ugly heads in various ways. Deaths of others, simple thoughts that come to us. It can be something as simple as a film we see or a book we read. Suddenly, we feel the anxiety here that says, we're not going to last forever. And the pleasure is all right, but where are we going? Why are we here? Is that all we're here to do? All those kinds of questions come up. Now, we're fortunate enough to have access to some source that helps us to deal with those questions. We begin a whole new process of life. If we don't have that source, then perhaps we put the questions away and they bubble up again at times and cause some painful questions about what we do. However, we're all in touch with tradition. We're sitting in the midst of them. And that means that we're moving along this road from self-indulgence to creativity, whatever we happen to be on. So let's talk a while about this other side of the issue, the creativity side of it, and exactly what we're trying to do. Most of us have pressed very hard to say that we're willing to do something that is going to make our life easier, more beautiful, more fun, happier. If you can convince someone that you've got something that will make their life happier, chances are pretty good that you'll have yourself a customer, whatever happens to be yourself. Everybody wants to live a life that's smoother, more enjoyable, more harmonized. And the great question is, how do we do that? Usually we begin by seeking other sources, authorities, ways that we seem to believe, for whatever reason, will give us this kind of satisfaction. So for example, some of us think it's money. We're miserable because we don't have money. If we had a lot of money, we wouldn't be miserable. So we go after the money and usually discover that's not exactly the case. Others decide they have to find the perfect man or the perfect woman, the soulmate. And if they just find that person, everything will be dandy. But it's very hard locating them. And we keep going outside of ourselves to find all this until one day perhaps we have the thought, maybe it's me. Maybe it's not out there. Maybe the world's just fine. It's neutral. It can be good or bad. But I'm the one who has a certain task in viewing it. I'm the one who's somewhat beclouded. The clouds aren't there, they're in my eyes. So what do we do at that point? We have to begin to go inward. We have to begin to understand ourselves. And this, of course, is where such traditions as astrology or alchemy or Rosicrucianism or Kabbalah or Buddhism and all the rest of them come in. They're forms of a very complete, very profound psychology that take us on this inner journey. Tells us things about who we are, what sorts of possibilities we have, where we're going, and where we've been. When we sit through it and have these experiences, they begin to open up depths for us. Now, in general, the depths that are opened are depths of potential. We have these moments when we suddenly see that we can do a lot more than we thought we could. We perceive ourselves perhaps as victims of circumstance. Our life from first to last has been a disaster. Everything we touched has gone sour. It's all been very bad, hard road. Then we start to think in this new way, though. We begin to wonder. Our first step is to say, well, relating back to the moon lecture, what if I try something new? What if I say that the world is not a terrible, vicious, ugly place? What if the world is a wonderful place? And what if all the suffering I have gone through has simply been intended to teach me something? I'm still here. I may have tendencies to feel a little depressed now and again, but on the other hand, I can be happy too. The potential is there. So what now if I perceive all my problems as being opportunities, as being a challenge? So that a negative thing happens to me, and instead of being sure that the cosmos has organized itself as a whole to defeat me, but rather it's an opportunity. It's something that I need to learn. The wonderful thing about this, of course, is that we read, for example, in Theosophy, and we find all this talk about initiations and trials. But a lot of us get these pictures. We see these immense caverns lit with these amazing lights, and we see people in robes, and all this wonderful sort of stuff. Not realizing that most of us will have our initiation and our trials in life. Our trials will be driving through rush hour traffic every morning and not being angry about it. Our trials will be some person running into us and not having insurance, and now we're in real financial hot water. Those are the kinds of things that try how deep our faith in the world and our understanding is. If it's deep enough, those things fall away from us. We deal with them. We make them into positive experiences. If it isn't deep enough, then we rage against the world. And we fail our trials and so on. Now, what are the initiations? Well, the initiations were described in the Greek mysteries as being a kind of experience, can't be put into words. It opens up whole new worlds. The Eleusinian mysteries, the initiate was supposed to see the souls in Hades, and actually Hades or Pluto himself on his throne. And then they were supposed to see the celestial gods, all this sort of thing. Now what if we interpret that as being a discovery of potentials? What if we say that initiation is that moment in our lives when we suddenly see what we're really capable of? In other words, when we see the divinities within ourselves, the demons, the dead, the living, the gods, and beyond all that, the one. We become cognizant that we have that within us. We begin to realize something even more interesting, which is that that power is something that broods over us, in a sense, in the way that a candy broods over a egg. When we're ready, that power, in a sense, becomes born into our lives. And this is the rebirth that we're always hearing about. And at that point, we awaken. The dream of life becomes lucid. We become enlightened. We see entirely differently the world around us. Now, what's the difference in the vision? The difference is that we're no longer self-indulgent. We're suddenly creative. Now, to be truly creative, whether you're a good cook, or you're a good housekeeper, or a wonderful painter, or a fabulous race car driver, whatever happens to be you, to be truly creative, you've got to lose yourself in what you're doing. You've got to become so immersed in the things you're working with that in a sense you ensoul them, and you're able to give them a kind of life they didn't have before. What, after all, is a great painting or a great statue, but an inanimate object, basically, essentially given life. And we look, for example, at a wonderful statue of the Buddha. If the artist has truly captured the vision of what Buddha meant to him or to her, then that piece of art takes on a kind of life. All of us at one time or another have been in a museum or have owned or have seen somewhere some work of art that was so powerful we just wanted it to talk to us. It had a kind of presence that made us feel almost as if it was a friend of ours, as if we were becoming reacquainted with someone that we had missed for a long time. That work of art has ensouled the artist's vision. The artist has lost himself or herself in that work. In Zen painting in particular, we see a process where some of the greatest Zen painters would sit before a blank sheet of paper for months, some of them for a year, and never make a single stroke. They would simply look at the paper. And the reason they did that was because they were composing the entire painting in their mind. They were losing themselves and seeing all the possibilities. If they were going to draw perhaps a caterpillar on a branch, they took away every line that wasn't essential to understanding the caterpillar on the branch. And then finally, when they arrived with a sense that they and the caterpillar and the branch had become one, with one quick stroke, they made it relevant. It was a successful rendering, and you had there in perhaps one or two lines the image of the caterpillar and the branch. Another wonderful thing is that, in contrast to Francis Bacon's statement that no human hand can make a perfect circle without a compass, many of these Zen painters go into a certain type of meditation and then proceed to produce a perfect circle from the most prized Zen scrolls. the better the circle, the more complete the state of enlightenment of the artist who did it. And the proof, of course, here is a potential. Why create a circle if not to say, you try and make a perfect circle, you won't be able to. Then ask yourself how I was able to. And you will see that my potential, my consciousness differs from yours. But you can reach mine if you so desire. You can also make that perfect circle. And beyond that, the idea is that a painter who can paint a perfect circle is a painter who has found the perfect balance and the perfect harmony in the world and within himself or herself, and then can express it through the brush on the paper. But this creativity goes beyond art. It goes also into every aspect of our lives. It changes our attitude from one of how are we being affected by others in our world. In other words, why is it that this particular person around us is so rude that they never notice when they do this, I do that. They've never noticed it. That sort of anger can sometimes happen, or the famous words, how can you be so inconsiderate? We change from that kind of thinking, which is self-indulgent, to the sort of thinking that says, first of all, I wonder if I do that. He begins to look around at the places that we do that. And then better yet says, this could be a very interesting situation. For example, perhaps we have a friend who's given to habitual behaviors. If you have had the experience of being in a particularly lucid frame of mind, you've had a friend who's come over and perhaps they're going through troubles, and they seem to be very mechanical to you. You say something, they don't really respond. They're talking about what they're talking about. You say something a little more startling, they're still not responding. You realize this happens over a period of time, consistently. Well, all of a sudden you're in the position of a Zen Roshi. The Zen Roshi looks out at the pupil, and usually the pupil is so nervous that all of the pupil's behavior becomes stereotypical. In other words, the Roshi has seen it all. He knows just how the pupil is going to act toward it. The overly respectful, the shivering, scared, the arrogant, audacious, all that stuff. He's seen it. It's all mechanical. He knows all about it. But it enables him to wait for the special moment and then do something really startling. Now, some of them, for example, would, in the midst of a very important discussion about Buddha, slap their disciples upside the head. Another one might run his finger along a piece of wood in the most excruciatingly annoying manner while the pupil is trying to talk. And we don't have to be perhaps that obnoxious, but you see, if we're awake, if we're alert to what's happening, and our friend is doing something very mechanical, we do have an opportunity, if we're truly kind, and if we truly care to help them, and are not doing this simply to make fun of them or for self-aggrandizement, we have the opportunity to startle them into realizing that. A well-placed word, a glance, a certain act can do wonders toward that. Now, of course, they might get very angry about it. Then again, they might laugh. Then again, they still might not notice it, which is a real challenge to our human being. But still, the point is, if we extend this to all aspects of our lives, this idea of creativity, we begin to become like these mad, childlike artists who always seem to be looking for something to do, some mischief to create in the world. They always know just what to do to astound somebody. We have, of course, our Picassos, our Henry Millers, and people of that type who never fail to be in a situation and absolutely destroy it in some way. Bring all the attention to themselves, perhaps, but nevertheless, they surprise everyone, Salvador Dali, perhaps one of the great masters of that approach. And we can adapt that lesson from life into our own life, and also approach every situation we find ourselves in as a creative opportunity. Now, how do we do this, though, without becoming menaces to ourselves and mankind? We do it by, first of all, purifying ourselves. There's a wonderful latchkey in all this, and that is that unless you're balancing, unless you're purifying, you're not going to get that higher state of consciousness. And what often happens is when we blissfully create chaos, we immediately descend down to the level of that chaos that we created. There's a wonderful Buddhist story about it's actually Hindu, not Buddhist, about a gentleman who reaches a high degree of enlightenment. And is pictured as standing upon the peak of a great mountain. And there is one of the great Mahatmas standing with him. He says, well, I've made it up to this level. I've done my He says, yes, you go. And he says, and appreciate what you have accomplished. Look below you. And the new Mahatma looks below and he sees the toiling masses. He hears their cries of suffering. And he thinks to himself, oh, I'm glad. I bet you can guess where he winds up this life back. Yeah, right back down there with all the rest of the family. Why? Because it was, again, self-indulgence, selfishness. He didn't think, I wish I could help him. I must dedicate myself to him. He thought, I don't have to suffer that anymore. So, if we do that, if we have a moment of clarity, and we use it for our own ends, we quickly discover ourselves ascending to a miserable state. I guarantee you that. I've experienced it myself many times. And one of the beauties of it is that it tends to become quicker and sharper as we go along. So that at first we hardly notice it, but as we're moving along and we're beginning to feel self-satisfied, when it hits, it hits. Very hard, very fast, and very profoundly. And what we have to realize at that instant is, whoops, I must have done something wrong here. And usually we can discover what it was very quickly if we just look around with open eyes. Usually it's screaming at us, in fact. We'll open books and find references that have to do exactly with what the problem is. People will call us and tell us about their problem, which is exactly what we've done wrong. That kind of thing. And we may not notice it because we're so stunned by the fact that we, such enlightened creatures, should be suffering what we are. And we hardly notice why it is that we're suffering. But we need to be aware of that. Usually the root of it is self-conceit, some form of selfishness. Putting ourselves before other people is the great formula. So if we want to develop this higher state of consciousness, we're going to have to purify ourselves. And the question is, how do we do that? And there's perhaps two ways of approaching it. They go together. The romantic way is we go out and we buy Blavatsky's Secret Doctrine, or the flower adorned the sutra, or Mr. Hall's encyclopedic outline, or whatever book happens to attract us. So we go to a society, we become involved there, we begin to really study all the juicy symbolisms, all the very arcane, strange writings. We fill up our house with books that have very ponderous bindings, frightening our friends to make them and we begin to struggle with those symbols. Now, one of the wonderful discoveries we make immediately is that we also are frightened of them to a certain degree. We're past the bindings, they don't bother us anymore. But in the introduction, maybe that's okay too. But if we get a little bit further in, we find these Rosicrucian mandalas with candles and eyes and quotations from the Bible and all sorts of stuff. That's it. The bus stops there. But we keep coming back to it, whether it be because we say we can't stand the fact that we don't understand it, or because we really sincerely want to know what these people were attempting to signify. And slowly things make sense to us. And what we discover is they only make sense one way. They make sense when some illustration, some myth accords with something within our own lives. Then it opens an inner experience, a vision of what the structure of our life is like. We begin to understand ourselves a little bit better. And that's what the whole process is about. That's the romantic way. Now, there are pitfalls to the romantic way, which should be very apparent to any of you who have been involved in this for any length of time. And that pitfall is symbolized by we call them the esoteric master. This is the individual who is an absolute genius in the esoteric symbology, who has read everything ever written in the Western tradition, who has the rarest manuscripts. And this is one of the most intolerable human beings we've ever met. They have an hideous temper. They're greedy, selfish, unkept. They wouldn't help anyone if their life depended on it. And they seem to be doing nothing but celebrating themselves. We just wonder, they couldn't have mastery over it. They couldn't really understand it. The fact of the matter is that they may have a perfect understanding of all that symbology, but they haven't figured out yet how to use it. Because the great irony here, the great sense of humor invested in all this, is the simple fact that all those symbols, all those big, scary, ponderous books, are all going to tell you some very simple things. They're going to tell you, be patient, be kind, care about other people, put other people before you. Don't assume that the world is an ignorant, chaotic place and you are a genius of a magnitude sufficient to recognize it. Assume that the world is full of genius and you are ignorant and chaotic. And then try to be taught by the world. And perhaps most of all, we can reduce it down to a simple idea, Christianity, the idea that we must love others. There's the key really to the whole thing. If you begin to have that sense of truly being able to look at a person and find something there to love, although it may sometimes be a difficult task, demanding creativity, then we begin to see that we really have put to use the symbology. Now, the alchemists were full of all sorts of wonderful arcane symbology. They said things like, if you turn up the fire too high under the alembic, you'll spoil the whole work. But then again, if it's too low, the work won't be completed. Now, what could that mean? You wonder about it. Now, once again, there's a sense of humor working here. Many people go out, even in this day and age, and buy themselves all kinds of alembics and little fire starters and wonderful chemicals, and they really labor in getting that fire just right. And that's fun. It's kind of ritualistic activity. But the point of the whole matter is very simple. The fire is aspiration, is desire for enlightenment. And if you turn it up too high, you'll spoil the whole thing. And if it's too low, it won't work either. You've got to find a golden mean. So you see how easily it fits in to our own personal experiences. Those who take it on a much more arcane, difficult level, the alchemists would perhaps say, let them be confused for a time until they realize that the truth is always simple. It's always the simplest, beautiful things that really have meaning to them. Most of us who are attracted to the esoteric symbology tend to be people who love that sort of thing. And some of us have been fortunate enough to know individuals who had almost no contact with any form of esoteric teaching, and yet were in themselves the warmest, kindest, most enlightened people one could ever hope to meet. They were simple, they did simple work, but everyone who they touched was very much moved by them. And these souls may be, in a sense, the most enlightened of them all. They don't need to celebrate themselves, they don't need to be famous, they don't need to write great poems. They simply do what they do, which is humility, and affect the people who come into their lives with faith that whoever needs to be there at a certain time will be there. And they'll know what to do if they look at that person and find what it is that's worthy of love in them. So let's consider for a moment some strategies of love. Problem, I think, that we all face. It's much easier for us to hate than love, and since we all live in this urban environment, our environment really preps us up for hating people, a lot of tension, stress, and that sort of thing. So wherever we look, there are all sorts of strategies to consider. None of them will work if you attempt to apply them as formulas, but things that simply occur. And any that are mentioned tonight are simply mentioned as examples and not as techniques. But the example is, perhaps we're approached by a particularly maddening individual who strikes us as being about one step above asleep, outrageously rude, and demanding, physically unattractive. Just an all-around impossible person to care about. Kind of look at them. There's nothing in the present tense that we can find. We just don't have the imagination that will appeal to us. Not even their color sense, even that's bad. It's just, there's nothing there. So what do we do? Well, there's one thing we might think of immediately, and it might be a little cynical, but it certainly works. And that is, once that person was a child. And at least I have yet to see a child who hasn't charmed me completely and taken that heart immediately. And that person who's become so dull, so slow, and so tired and ugly to us was once a beautiful child. And if life has made of them something we find unattractive, that is a very heavy burden that they bear. And we can love them for the child that they were. We can also love them for what they've become, knowing what kinds of experiences must have caused them to become that way. And here we begin to have a really tremendous strategy for dealing with these people, because when we see the child in them, we can begin to relate a little bit to the child in them. Somewhere down there, however old and dour we might be, there's a child waiting. And if we can somehow speak to that child, we can somehow bring out even a bit of it, suddenly we get a resonance. We're doing some good. We're bringing out some spiritual beauty in that person. Now what brings that out? Here's a key, important consideration. It isn't us. That's the first most important discovery. There's a wonderful statement that Mr. Hall once made. I don't believe it's ever been put in print, but I hope it will one day be. Which was that when we have ideas, experiences that completely transform our lives, they're not our ideas. They're divine ideas. When we have sudden insights that enable us to really help others, they're not our insights. They're divine insights. It's very important to consider that. We are, in a sense, spectators. Jacob Boehme once said that once he had become enlightened, once the Spirit had awoken in him, he spent the rest of his life as an excited spectator. He just watched what happened, watched all the miracles that he wrought in his life. He never had anything to do with them. His main task, apparently, he put it, was to stay out of the way. As soon as he stepped in the middle, because he thought he could do it a little bit better, chaos ensued. But we realized that he didn't have to sit around and worry about how will I handle that situation. Rather than he would simply enter the situation, and that the divine within him would recognize the divine elements in the situation and would find a beautiful accord and would know just the thing to do. And this is that kind of behavior that the enlightened often have. We have wonderful examples of Eastern sages in particular. The group one is Sri Ramana Maharshi, who were approached by Western scientists. And these scientists had heard about the clairvoyance of these sages. They asked them questions, for example, about the theory of relativity. What do they think about that? And usually, in this case, Sri Ramana Maharshi, the sage is usually very childlike about it and simply says, well, what is the theory of relativity? Explain it. And the scientist explains it. And then the sage begins to discuss it in the most amazing terms. The scientist feeling there's no way that anybody who didn't have a complete mastery of that subject matter could have these insights. The simple matter is that the spontaneous, divine, childlike presence in that sage is responding to the situation as simply spoken. And the really wonderful thing about it is, I strongly suspect, that were we able to have a little conversation in the sage afterwards, the sage would say, boy, wasn't that great? I mean, I wonder where that came from. I really learned something. That normally happens, for example, when one lectures. There's a voice that speaks, and then there's the rest of you that just listens. thinks, boy, that's really a marvelous thing. I should practice that myself. That sort of experience. Spontaneity, being wide open to the environment we happen to find ourselves in. A good example that perhaps all of us can remember is when we have been confronted in our childhood with an exam of some sort. Particularly if we went to a certain kind of school where the exams were particularly ugly. And we worried about it. We went down there to take that exam, and we were carrying the weight of the planet Earth on our backs. It was all there. All the failure and starvation waiting for us if we didn't get the grade we needed on that exam. And we basically did that exam, wrote it out, through this incredible haze of anxiety, worry, confrontation, conflict, anger, frustration. Now, what if we had walked into that situation and instead had the sense of, well, one day I'm going to die, for example, and whether I believe I'm going to pop out of the body or not, this exam isn't going to make a lot of difference in that time. I mean, I'm not really going to care. And I don't even have to die, as a matter of fact. Actually, in a month or two, I'm not really going to care about this. Give it 10 years, it's a really important final exam. But it's really not going to matter. In fact, it'll be hard to remember, probably. So if we walk in thinking that, saying, I really don't care. We listened. We've looked over the material, we've absorbed what we could. And we sit down and we kind of smile, a sense of pathos for those who are sitting around us sweating and breaking pencils and crumpling things up and creaking their chairs and that sort of thing. And then we simply approach the test as if it were a game. We look at it and we think, well, let's see how we're going to do it here. This will be interesting. What kind of reflection will it show me of my learning? Chances are that we're going to be a lot more successful when we're so relaxed taking that test. We're going to be much calmer. We're going to be spontaneous. And the great wonder is we may discover some fabulous things. For example, some time ago, I was faced with one of the great 3-hour preparatory exams used to decide who goes to what graduate school. It's one of the truly inhuman devices fabricated by modern society, and one of the most illogical in many ways. And being a verbal character and not very mathematical, I expected to have to score brilliantly on the verbal and just give up the mathematics. It was that simple. But I did approach the exam in the way that it's been described. And the great shock of the matter was I did the math great, and I had a little bit more trouble with the verbal. The reason being that I had, you see, prepared harder for the verbal, thinking that that was my strength and I should really hone into a fine edge. The math, which I had really not bothered with at all, I was fresh and spontaneous with, and I was solving problems I never could have figured out if I had really sat down and memorized the formulas and that sort of thing. So again, it's openness. Now that relates to careers and relationships as well as schooling. It relates to every aspect of life. We're going to take a break now and come back and talk some more about it. Very available. We have this wonderful lectern. Because I don't use notes, I use the lectern for 3 reasons. One, it gives me a sense of importance. It doesn't know what you can do. And 2, it gives me somewhere to put my hand. It's a terrible experience when you're lecturing, you've got your pockets long and all this sort of stuff. So you don't want to be casual on your waving hands. It does that too. But then the main reason is I've developed a great deal of affection for this lectern. Because you see, I get a beautiful view of it. And I hope that before you leave, if you wish, you'll come by and take a look at these beautiful wood grains that are here. They look like waves. And I think you have some too, if they're not dramatic, sideways waves. And they, in a sense, are my notes. They remind me of things. There's a very wonderful beach in Oregon, and I'm sure there are some beaches like this elsewhere. There's no one I happen to know of, where you can see some pretty amazing things. If you're fortunate enough to have a room to stay in that has a fire, and we have the right sort of weather, you will notice that the wood fallen on the side of the beach all has this kind of grain to it. And the sand, which is very firm there because of the cold weather, also has that kind of wood grain to it. And you'll also notice that the water moves in these kinds of swirls and waves. And then when you go back into your room and you warm up a bit, you see that the fire is also moving in the same kinds of swirls. And then you can go a step further and spoil that wonderful natural experience by dragging science into it and discovering that your bones have exactly the same structure as water. Simply flow into the shape of the bones and flows. This begins to cause clot. And the first thing one realizes is that clot also moves in this kind of rippling, ring-like pattern. And in the next process, the next discovery is that life moves that way. Now most of us who consider the idea of being creative in life think about seizing on aspects of life and working our will on it. We get an idea, we put that idea to work. We try to make the world into the kind of shape that we want it to have. Some of us are successful at it, and I suggest that they're successful because they happen at that instant to agree with the brain. And their desire happens to agree with what we might call natural or divine desire. And so they accomplish, perhaps unconsciously, what they wish to accomplish. Most of us, on the other hand, experience a kind of frustration. We have various reactions to it. Frustration is that we see something opens up in our lives, and we move toward it, and we attempt to make something of it. And then that something gets taken out of our hands, or it simply loses the shape, takes a different shape that we haven't intended. It can be something as simple, for example, as the decision that we're going to clean up our house. And just completely, all the books we don't need anymore out. Paint the walls a pleasant color. Scrub everything, vacuum, do all that stuff. And every day something happens. And every night something happens. And we keep wanting to do it and we never seem to get the opportunity. Now there are several ways we can respond to that kind of situation. We can respond by saying that life is chaos and terrible how things are happening. People just won't leave us alone. We just don't have a minute to ourselves. That's a reaction, again, rather self-indulgent. We can react with panic, feeling the sense of things slipping away from us and wanting to desperately make them reach the kind of form that we want them to reach. And then on the other hand, we can simply decide that, well, we may want to clean up, and that might be a great idea, but apparently the cosmos doesn't want us to clean up right now, and the cosmos is considerably wiser than we are. Better that we simply go ahead and do what the cosmos has in mind. And then perhaps we will someday have the opportunity to clean. Now, of course, this is an allegory, because all of us are cleaning our houses all the time if we're on a spiritual path. Our houses are ourselves. And very often we find that we just don't have time to do it. What we'd like to do is spend a good 2 weeks, a year, 10 years meditating in a cave in the Himalayas on some Tibetan deity, and then we'll be ready. But the opportunity just doesn't come. We'd like to get out of Los Angeles and go move somewhere that's beautiful and green and wonderful, but the opportunities just don't come. There's too many things to do here. There's people who rely on us. There are activities that only we can discharge. So we have, again, this idea of recognizing that it is in the relationship between ourselves and the world, when these are together, that the truly meaningful things happen. It's having the faith and the trust in the idea that this world is suffused with intelligence, with consciousness, with love, most of all, and that things happen for a reason. Now we have this mind that enables us to separate. It's a very handy tool. It really enables us to understand things we would not be able to understand otherwise. We can abstract, we can draw away from reality. The problem is that this tool has somewhat run amok. It's like a chainsaw out of control, and you're not able to make it do what it wants to do. And so what it does is it abstracts all the time. So for example, we're in the mood for some solitude and quiet. We've abstracted and decided that's what we need. A series of logical and emotional assumptions. But we don't have the opportunity. Then we have the opportunity, and we don't want to. We want to go out and see movies or meet people. We feel very sociable. We always seem to be out of sync with the opportunities. And there are several ways of approaching that problem. The sanest, perhaps, is simply to say to ourselves, how about for a while I don't worry about what I want to do? How about for a while I just see what happens? I get up in the morning, and if it's a day when I don't have anything pre-planned, I wait for the telephone to ring. If I have some time, I go ahead and do what it is I feel like doing. If I'm interrupted, I'm interrupted. This is illustrated by one of the great problems for meditators in modern America, or actually in Western civilization in most of the world, and that is the telephone. Many of us feel a sense of responsibility to our telephone. The telephone rings, we must answer. And that's all right. The problem is when we get irritated about answering, and a whole chain reaction sets in. It begins when we sit down, and we settle down to a wonderful meditation, refresh ourselves, and the telephone rings. And we say to ourselves, I'm not going to answer the telephone. Then we say, I think I should answer the telephone. So maybe we get this conflict. And then we go answer the telephone and feel a tremendous amount of resentment for the poor individual on the other side who's called us, as if they knew that we were meditating. They did this deliberately to protect our patience. And we walk away from the situation thoroughly irritated, and we find it very difficult to meditate. And if we're really creative in abusing ourselves, we decide that we're not going to be able to meditate at all in any of those situations. Yes. Now the other alternative is to simply get up and answer the phone. And then we go back to the meditation and we're through that phone call. We just decide that if something is important enough, if the telephone have to ring to interrupt us, then in the eye of the cosmos, in the eye of the deity, it's more important than our meditation. So what can we learn? What can we give to this other person? And then, when we go down and pick our meditations later, we may discover that it's all the stronger because of the patience we've exercised. And then we discover something a step further, and that is that meditation as such is not, strictly speaking, something that we do by sitting down and concentrating on something. Those are kind of the beginnings of meditation. That's where we all begin. The true idea of meditation is a constant state. And in a sense, every time one sits down to meditate or does any kind of practice of that sort, they're refreshing themselves in that state. They're getting a momentum going. And the idea is to be in that momentum all the time. So for example, in a Zen temple, you are expected to meditate while sleeping, while walking around the grounds, while listening to the Roshi quote from the sutra. All sorts of activities, cooking food, washing dishes. You're supposed to be able to maintain that level of meditation, openness. Now we have a Western tradition that corresponds in some sense, but it has a slightly different approach. And since this is Venus that we're discussing, I think very apropos tonight, Venus is in Pisces, in the perfect Piscean religion in terms of Christianity. Our tradition, and perhaps one that's more comfortable to many of us because we grew up with it, has an approach that is completely focused on the idea of love. And we can say then that love as meditation is the idea of Christian practice, learning to sense the love all around us, in others, in the events that happen to us, finding the resonance of love within ourselves and sharing it with others. This is really the main practice that any of us can be involved in. And actually, Buddhism, which by some is considered a cold religion, has the same idea. In contrast for it with the story that I gave about the poor Mahatma who was wound up down in the realm of chaos because he had a selfish thought. I'll give you the story of how the Bodhisattva Kuan Yin became the Bodhisattva and commenced the mercy tradition in Mahayana Buddhism. The story is that the man who became Kuan Yin reached a state of enlightenment in the Hinayana school, symbolized by his standing on a mountain peak at a gate. Beyond that gate there was nothing but a haze of white light. And if he stepped through that gate, he would reach nirvana. He would be completely free of the circle of reincarnation. But he felt something not quite right in the situation. Something bothered him a little bit. Couldn't put his finger on it. And then he heard a small baby bird twittering. And he turned and he saw there was a nest right next to the gate. And in it there was a dead mother bird and several baby birds who were starved because the mother had died. And at that moment he vowed that he would not enter nirvana until every soul, until every baby bird, every little iota floating in a sunbeam reached enlightenment also. Only then would he enter nirvana. And he would re-enter this world over and over again to aid in any way that he could those who remain behind. And that certainly is also a kind of love. Kind of selflessness. So we have this tradition all around us. And we have the fact that it transforms us, transmutes us, as they said in alchemists. Now what we need University in China, so that we can look back in our lives and find that even the most harrowing experiences offer us opportunities. We can discover in the persons who seem most evil to us some iota of good. And even if we can't do that, if we can realize the terrible suffering that a person so hardened must be feeling, if we can realize the sorts of experiences that must have happened to them to get them to that position, we can begin to transform ourselves. There are all sorts of wonderful little practices that are used by various people for this. Again, illustrations. Some, when they meditate, will conjure up images of all the people they've ever hurt and who have hurt them. And they ask forgiveness. And they grant forgiveness to those people. You'd be surprised how many they remember as the days go by and how many new ones they add. But the wonderful thing, of course, about that sort of practice, when it's very sincere, is that it produces a kind of alertness toward others that helps us to not hurt them, helps us to be sensitive to what kind of good we can do for them. Because we don't want to add to the list of those we already have to remember. But behind all this tradition, behind all this symbology, behind all our experiences, all the people we meet in, is this one principle of love. Seeking that with our whole heart and with our whole mind is what we're here to do. The measure of love we're able to share with others is in a sense the measure of our enlightenment. It is our alertness, our awakeness, that depends on how much we love. Love has a very close relationship to attention, for example. When we love someone or we love something, we give it a great deal of attention. And we learn a great deal about it because of that. Now, a person who is set upon disliking someone, in other words, all of us, in certain situations, will read surfaces, will make a snap judgment for some reason, perhaps something that's said or whatever happens to be a resemblance, and will then just look for things to support the snap judgment. See that? That's just what I expected. That kind of dynamic sets in. But the attention is minimal. If you ever work, for example, in a shop, you will learn the fabulous technique of ignoring the customer. If someone who bothers you happens to come into the store, you are very busy all of a sudden. You're looking at folks who are leaping through shelves, you're doing all sorts of very busy things. And your attention is in no way on that person. But, on the other hand, if you have a sense of love toward others and you really wish to see in that person the aspect that's resonating with love, and you pay a great deal of attention to them. You really look at them. You really listen to them. In other words, you open yourself wide to them. There are some wonderful descriptions of Albert Einstein by people who interviewed him. We all agree about one thing. He had this incredibly disarming habit of really paying attention to people who were speaking to him. He just fixed his eyes on theirs, and he fixed all his attention and listened to every word as if the entire universe was in the balance. And it didn't matter how long they talked, just listen. And of course, none of them was often said about him was what a great love he had for humanity and for the people that he met. So his great qualities. These go together in this sense. Now, how do we do this? What kind of approaches do we have? We have our tradition, we have keep in our minds the idea that we can feel love for anyone. But how do we really cultivate this? We can approach such an individual as John Lucid, who wrote a great deal on the subject, and certainly in many ways personified him. We have in the New Testament and aspects of the Old Testament some of the greatest guidance, statements, and insights having to do with love that one could ever hope to find. We have examples in the Buddhist sutras of how to approach with. But beyond that, we see all those are half aid and half distraction. The better they are, the less distraction they are. The Buddha sutras, for example, especially for a Westerner, tend to be a tremendous distraction because they delight in giving you these huge lists of names of bodhisattvas. They're beautiful names. By the time you get through them, you've pretty much forgotten what it was you were reading about. And you sort of have to go back and remember again. Now, the New Testament tends to be quite good in the sense that it gives us nice, short, very powerful ideas. But then again, there are aspects of it, perhaps through interpolation or our own lack of understanding that startle us here and there. And then again, very unfortunately, some of us have had bad enough experiences with some form of church that we find it very difficult to have a sense of the core of the scriptures in the Christian tradition. But in any case, we have this two-edged element. We have the distraction that enables a person to be a pedant, to be someone who knows the Bible forwards and backwards, all the Buddhist sutras, Dr. Higgins' Anaclepsis, and the Secret Doctrine, and recite vast tracts out of them to you, but who practice absolutely nothing talked about there or esoteric mastery as listed earlier. we have to get then into a deeper part of ourselves. And that part has to do with trust. It has to do with not expecting hurt from the world. Why is it that we will meet an individual and think that they are not worthy of our time, that we're not going to pay attention to them, we're not going to risk loving them? How does that happen? Sometimes it happens because we're busy. Some of us specialize in being busy. And it's also helpful that when you consider the word big business to mispronounce it as big busyness, which is a tremendous amount of insight into the way busyness is handled in this country. A country full of busyness people. And busyness is a kind of religion for many of us. We're always busy. We just don't have time to relate to anybody. It's impossible. You've got to rush off and do something. That isn't perhaps the major problem. I would suggest that something's lurking below that, something a little bit more potent, that masquerades as busyness. And that is simple fear, distrust, feeling that no, if we open up, we're opening ourselves up to be hurt. Most of us have heard at least once in our lives this bit of sage wisdom. Never open yourself up to people, they'll just trample on you. That's usually heard. What we need to discover is, first of all, if we truly open ourselves up, there's nothing to trample on. That's the great beauty of it. The person who is truly open, who truly loves another person, who is not in any way invested with a self-desire, dealing with them, really offers nothing to be trampled. They are also tremendously creative. Here again is the idea of creativity. In other words, every attempt to be trampled upon becomes something that they're able to work with. It can be a wonderfully maddening process if you happen to be the one desiring to do the trampling. Every insult, every gesture meant to hurt is somehow turned around magically in some wonderful insight, and the person just is cheered together and just doesn't work. This is because the depth of love, the depth of consciousness functioning there, understands that any effort to hurt another person is based on previous hurt. Someone who is after you, who wants to hurt you in some way, is suffering. Whether it be that they're attempting to rob you or merely insult you, there is some sort of pain in the background. There are some wonderful stories about sages, the Chinese especially enjoy these, who are sitting in their very small little house. They've got a few possessions, very little actually. And in the middle of the night, a thief creeps in. And the thief picks up perhaps a nice little begging bowl. He picks up a nice little rug. He begins to walk out. And the priest says, wait! And before the thief has a chance to run, the priest says, take these. And he gives him everything he has. And there are several endings to the story. Sometimes the thief immediately sets down the material he was stealing and wishes to become a student or a disciple or a teacher. Other times he goes off with all the stuff and disappears for 6, 7, 8 years, and then he pops up again and says, you might not remember me, but I stole from you. I've been haunted by your act ever since. I have to come back and ask you why. Why did you do that? The sage has a wonderful answer, and the answer is, because you needed it more than I did. If you were so desperate, if you were willing to come in here and risk your life and mine together, then certainly you need it. And so the sage went. He able to transform that person in some way. But here's that tremendous selflessness, that tremendous love and positivity. There are aspects in the Christian scriptures that have to do with seeing everyone around you as family. The simplest way to put it. In other words, if they're older than you are, then they are a parent or a grandparent. And they are the dearest parent and grandparent that ever was. If they're the same age, then they are your sister or brother. And if they're younger, then they're your child. And this is perhaps the most profound, exquisite advice ever offered in any tradition. We have a similar Tibetan tradition that has this argument. Since you're Tibetan, you believe in reincarnation. Now, if you're also Tibetan, you believe that there is no beginning to reincarnation. That it stretches far, far back. We've all been incarnated thousands and tens of thousands of times. Now, if that's the case, it means that every person you will ever meet, and they will go further and say every animal, everything, they will include the whole world, has at some time been your mother. But, a little more complex than that. Not only have they been your mother, but they have been a mother who has sacrificed everything for you. They've been a mother who was so dedicated to you, so full of love for you, that they actually died so that you could live. There were infinite lives, and certainly that has happened between all of us, perhaps many times. And so the idea is that when you run into somebody who you find obnoxious, you think to yourself, this person was once my mother, and this person once sacrificed himself for me, was filled with love, suckled me at their own breast, really cared for me. And now they've fallen on hard times. They're suffering now. They've got a life that's full of suffering. The very least that I can do is to be kind, to be considerate, to be helpful to them, to try and help them lift the load a little bit. That's a really wonderful allegory, wonderful image. But it's the same idea as thinking of everyone around us as close family. It's a tremendously transforming influence in our lives. We can begin to practice it. So going back a step, we have this idea that behind all the doctrines, all the symbologies is love. And I might add that you will find all over the place in alchemical, Rosicrucian traditions, Kabbalah and all that, hearts, flaming hearts, blazoned all over various pictures. And usually that is a heart that has been touched by spirit. It's a kindled heart, a heart that is awakened. It's a heart full of love. Because love, like fire, lends light and it lends warmth. It helps us to see more clearly, but it helps us to feel warmth toward people, to nurture them, to have a sense of nurturing from them. So here we have our fire in the heart symbology. And this tends to be at the center of all these various systems. Now, considering the fact that these systems are merely dramatization of life, they are passion plays constructed by individuals who wish to instruct us or to tell us about experiences they have had that aren't easily put into words. So in a sense, they take elements that are particularly bold out of life and they put them together into a form. And if we have enough sensitivity and openness, we begin to understand them. For instance, in the Codex Rosicrucius, there's a wonderful little statement that I can't remember the exact number. I think it's a quotation in the book of Job it's referred to. It says, if you can understand this diagram, and that quotation is there, is the key, you can understand Holy Scripture. But if you don't understand the diagram, you don't understand how those pictures. The key to the diagram is again flame and heart. Is again this idea of reality and of spirit. This transformation that happens when the fire comes into the heart. But once again, these are dramatizations. What does that mean? It means that they're exaggerations of what's actually out there in life. So that what has to happen is we have to realize, this is a wonderful discovery, and I'll support it rather sneakily by saying something before I actually make the statement, which is LaFollette will tell you that actually everything in this world is a reverse of how it seems. Well, in this world, secret teachings of all ages and the secret doctrine and all that material seems like the most difficult, ponderous, advanced, complex of anything you could study tradition. It seems like just the most challenging. Well, the truth is the reverse. And the truth is that it is a bunch of nursery school texts. And it is. It takes the child and teaches the child to look out into the world and see those things. There's a key to it. To take the initiation experience in the Eleusinian mysteries and apply it in the streets of Athens is the idea. To realize that the mysteries are around us all the time. And the doctrine is around us all the time. That nature goes hand in hand with the various scriptures and symbologies. And that all of them draw whatever works in them out of nature. We begin to be able to interpret our lives then in terms of these symbologies. We see much more deeply than we've ever seen before. In other words, when an event happens to us, it doesn't seem like some disconnected, meaningless thing. First we say to ourselves, it happens for a reason. Then we look around and see what sorts of things related to in our lives. And we understand that it has something to say to us. We see a dynamic. And sometimes we're fortunate. And we see a dynamic that stretches far into the past. And we see this kind of beautiful pattern at work in our lives. We see that while we were looking over there, the grain of moon was spreading out in this direction. One is reminded of Oscar Wilde's very witty and wonderful statement that life is something that happens to you while you're busy with something else. That's what most of us are doing all the time. We're busy with something else while life is happening. So life is happening, and we can have a sense of faith about it happening. We will be in the right place at the right time. There's a situation that often happens with persons who become involved in the esoteric traditions. The first flush of passion for it. It can last anywhere from a few weeks for the very fortunate to years and years and years for less fortunate. And that is what we might call initiation anxiety. That's the idea that there are these mystical experiences, and perhaps there are these masters out there. Boy, we really want to be able to get in touch with it. How do we do it? We start to read everything inside. We get very anxious about how it's going to happen. We imagine seeing people standing in our rooms and stuff like that, and then realize that there's a shadow of a cat or something like that. Perhaps we meet somebody and they say, oh yes, in fact, the constant remain has been in my room several times. Happens, believe me. And we think, why do they have these experiences and we don't? We're trying very hard. Actually, the anxiety is most of the reason why we're not having experiences. And the second reason is that the way we visualize the experiences is pretty much off the mark. In other words, we're taking the symbols literally. And you get these statements all over the esoteric tradition. Don't take this literally. All the time. This is not literal. Look through the surface. The Tibetans are terribly witty. They have this wonderful poster of Avalokiteshvara, who is a bodhisattva who has 1,000,000 hands. They make great archangelic beings. And within the palm of every hand there is an eye. The idea is that all those eyes see all the suffering in the world, and all those hands are able to aid the suffering. They're all a skill and understanding that helps aid the suffering. But the really wonderful thing is that there's one set of hands that's just like this, with a heart rate. And if you look very carefully, you'll see that there's empty space between those hands. Just this cloudy blue is behind the figure in general. And what the figure is saying to you is, I am empty. Look beyond me. That's what we need to remember about all these symbols, especially when we have initiation fever. We have to realize that it may be happening to us, but not in the way that we expect. It comes out of unexpected quarters. Because the whole world is infused with love. And better still, the whole world is also infused with a loving sense of humor. Kind of go hand in hand. The tendency is to give us things that surprise us. The key meetings, the key events, the key books are the ones that we just don't expect. Perhaps we get a day full of frustrations, we keep missing how to reach for it. And then the right thing is handed to us. When you think about it, it's very witty. Throw us right off the mark. And then hand us the key to it all. And the question is, will we be able to center ourselves enough to appreciate it? To see it, although it seems fine. The best cure for initiation fever is a real commitment to helping others. That's the key to it all. The acid test for any experience that comes to you is quite simple. Is this an experience that in some way helps me to help others? If it is, then it is legitimate. It has that predicate. If it doesn't, then be wary of it. Look at it a little bit more closely. And sometimes, I might add, these can be very subtle. It can be a difference of cleverness in a project that you're involved in versus sincerity. The cleverness may be so profound that you think to yourself, I'm teaching them something about themselves when I do this. What's actually happening there is a little bit different. And you'll feel it. There's always a sense of uneasiness when those events come up. And the events that are full of life, full of love, full of wisdom, are events that resonate so powerfully that we do not mistake them. And I'd like to add to that the observation that in being alert to those experiences, we have to be aware of the fact that life is a process. And this means some interesting things. It means, for example, that the person we met a year ago, who we considered to be absolutely obnoxious and as moronic as anyone we'd ever met, may be the person who has the very word of wisdom we need to hear at that moment, a year later. And then again, a person who tells us something that just sets us aglow because it's so full of love and wisdom, may, a week or two later, say something that is horrifyingly foolish to us. We have to realize that people are very complex. They have their ups and downs, just as we do, in the sense of moments of great clarity and moments of less clarity, part of the natural process. And that there is no reason to judge one against the other. In other words, if we can be present to the moment of that experience, we will know whether it is authentic or not. We will know whether it feeds the heart, whether it sets us into a kind of dilation, where we expand, we open, we feel a sense, if you like, of the cosmos. Those kind of effects will usually indicate to us that we're on the right track. Now, of course, there are some, perhaps, who experience the cosmos because they're about to make a lot of money or something like that, and suddenly feel like ruler of the universe. And most of us are clever enough to recognize those egotistical feelings. And the key to them is in Venus. Because the great question we can put to ourselves when we're not real sure is this self-indulgence, or is this creativity dedicated to helping others? In other words, am I using every resource I can to help people by doing this? Or am I getting some satisfaction out of it? What makes it complex is that the satisfaction is there even when we are being selfless. In fact, it's much greater. But the question is, where are you focused? If you're focused on the satisfaction, in other words, if you pick up the phone and say, oh, I just dreamt up the greatest idea. I'm going to make $1 million on this idea. It'll help people too. You just told yourself the answer to the story. Likely as not, drop the project or change it, because you're not in it to help others, you're in it to make the money. On the other hand, if you say nothing at all, because you're very moved by the process, or if you simply say, I found something very beautiful and I feel rather humbled by the idea that I might be able to accomplish this, you have that kind of an approach. Now you've got something happening that's far more positive. And I'd like to finish with a statement that I think is quite nice, a little off the cuff. And that is, not too long ago, I was fortunate enough to hear Mr. Hall speaking about this tradition and what it's like to be working with it during a time when it isn't a very popular tradition, when, in a sense, the battle is very much uphill. And the statement he made was, a quotation from a famous American president, was that it's better to be on the side of the battle or the force that must in the end win, and to lose in service of it, than it is to win in service of a force that eventually must lose. All of us have that choice. We have that wonderful statement, you cannot serve God and mammon. And those choices come up to us all the time. And what they basically are saying to us is, do you want to be self-indulgent and serve the force that in the end must fail in your own life, that fails in death, and perhaps in the life of the world, that fails either in death or in the eventual enlightenment of the collective? Or do you serve the force that ultimately must win, for you and for the collective, for your fellow human beings, as you wish to be a Tibetan, for all the animals and terrors and everything else in the body? Which one is it that you wish to commit